On a winter night in 1811, the Mississippi River did something no man on the frontier had ever seen. It shuddered. It groaned. Then it rose up like a living thing and began to move the wrong way. Men would later swear they heard the earth itself crack open under their boots. They would say the trees bent as if bowing to some invisible king, that the water vanished from the shoreline and came back screaming, and that the darkness over New Madrid, Missouri, felt less like night and more like a warning. But on that first night, before anyone understood what was happening, there was only fear. And in the middle of that fear was a 19-year-old river hand named Nathan Hale Mercer, who had come to the Mississippi Territory to make a life for himself and instead found himself standing at the edge of the end of the world. Nathan was not a soldier, not a preacher, not a man with any claim to greatness. He was the son of a ruined miller from Kentucky, a boy with cracked hands, a flint knife, and a habit of listening too carefully when older men lied. He had been hired to work a flatboat run between settlements along the river, hauling salted pork, lamp oil, tools, iron nails, and barrels of whiskey to places that barely deserved the name of town. In those days, New Madrid was not a city in the modern sense. It was a brittle frontier outpost pressed against the river like a thumbprint in wet clay, a few rough streets, a tavern with warped boards, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, a trading post, a handful of cabins built low to the ground because everyone believed the next flood would be the worst one yet. They were wrong. The river did not warn them with one giant blow. It began with small things. A dog that howled at empty ground. A spring that turned muddy overnight. A horse that reared and snapped its tether for no reason anyone could prove. Then in mid-December, the earth gave its first violent cough. Nathan remembered it not as a quake but as a punch from below. He had been inside a storage shed near the riverbank, counting flour sacks by lantern light when the wooden wall beside him buckled inward. The shelf behind him burst open. Nails rolled across the floor. A barrel toppled and split. Somewhere outside, a man shouted, then screamed, then stopped screaming so suddenly that the silence after it felt unnatural, as if the world had swallowed him whole. Nathan ran out into the cold and found the settlement in motionless terror. Chimneys had cracked, boards had fallen. People stood in the street with white faces and open mouths, staring first at the ground and then at one another, trying to decide which was worse. Then the aftershocks began. Not just one, not just two. They came in waves or pulses, as if some monstrous machine beneath the earth had forgotten how to stop. The second quake hit after midnight. The third came before dawn. By the end of the week, everyone in New Madrid had begun sleeping in their clothes, in wagons, in fields, or not at all. They prayed with more desperation than faith. They gathered near fires and spoke in voices so low they sounded ashamed of their own fear. Some said the earthquakes were punishment for the sins of the new republic. Some said the Spanish had tunneled under the land and planted powder. Some said the river had a spirit and it had woken angry. Nathan listened to all of them and believed none of it. What frightened him most was that no one seemed able to explain anything. The river was the heart of that territory. Everything moved by water, everything lived by the river's moods. The settlements depended on it, feared it, and trusted it more than any road or roadmaker. If the Mississippi changed course, families would starve. If the banks collapsed, supply lines would vanish. If the river became unstable, then the frontier itself was no longer a place a man could stand with confidence. On the fourth day after the first quake, Nathan was sent with two others upriver to check a half-submerged bend where several small boats had been tied before the tremors began. One of the men was an old trapper named Dobbins, broad as a barrel and missing two fingers from his left hand. The other was a young trader named Silas Pike, who carried a Bible in his coat and a pistol in his belt, and believed both objects could be used to settle disputes. The sky was iron gray. The water ran black and hard and seemed to carry a smell Nathan had never known before, something like mud, fish, and broken stone. They found the boats, but one of them was sitting at a strange angle, wedged against the bank where no current should have placed it. The hull had been split open. Inside the broken boat they found sacks of salt, a lantern, a torn blanket, and one dead mule staring upward with frozen eyes. Silas crossed himself. Dobbins spat into the river, "This ain't no flood damage." Nathan climbed down closer to the wreck and saw that the bank itself had slumped inward. Trees had been dragged into the water. A seam in the earth had opened and closed again, leaving behind a jagged line of wet clay. There were fresh boot prints near the edge. "Someone was here last night," Nathan said. Dobbins crouched and touched the mud. "Not someone, several." That should have been the end of it, just another frontier mystery to be swallowed by weather and time. But then Nathan found the mark. It was cut into a tree trunk just above the flood line, 3 short lines and a cross beneath them, carved fresh enough that the wound in the bark still looked wet. Nathan knew that mark. He had seen it 2 weeks earlier on a stranger's satchel in the tavern yard. The stranger had been a tall man with a scar under one eye and gloves too fine for the frontier. He had asked questions about the river, the settlements, the road to the post at Herculaneum, and the location of the old Spanish supply trail that had long ago been forgotten by most people. He had bought no drink, eaten no meal, and left without giving his name. Nathan remembered because the man had looked at him too long, as if measuring him for a coffin. When Nathan mentioned the mark, Silas frowned. "What does it mean?" "Don't know," Nathan said, "but I've seen it before." Dobbins rose slowly, every joint cracking like a trap being sprung. "Then we'd better hope it means nothing." He was wrong. That same night, the river began to behave as if it were alive. The water pulled backward, not metaphorically, not in rumor. It withdrew from the banks in a visible retreat, exposing slick mud, stranded fish, and objects that had been hidden for years. Children cried, dogs barked madly, men ran down to the shoreline to stare in disbelief at a Mississippi that seemed to be leaving its own bed. Nathan stood with a lantern and watched the current reverse in jagged surges, the surface folding over itself like a ripped sheet. Then the shock came. The earth convulsed with such force that one of the chimneys in New Madrid collapsed into the street. A church bell rang by itself. Wagons jumped on their axles. People fell to their knees in the dust and cried out to God, not because they expected rescue, but because they needed something larger than themselves to address. When the trembling eased, the river had returned. But it had returned wrong. The shoreline had shifted. A cluster of cottonwoods that had stood on dry ground the day before now leaned out over new water. A stretch of bank had been swallowed. One family's cabin had slid halfway into the river, leaving the father's armchair sitting alone in the yard like a joke told by a cruel man. In the days that followed, the settlement learned that fear could become a routine. That was the worst of it. People can survive one disaster. They can survive a fire, a raid, a flood, a winter. But when disaster becomes predictable, when the ground itself seems to rise and fall according to no law anyone understands, the mind begins to loosen. Men stopped sleeping. Women stopped baking. Children stopped wandering farther than a few yards from their parents. Everyone listened for the next groan beneath the earth. Nathan, because he was young and stubborn, tried to work anyway. But the river kept offering him clues. The same carved mark appeared on fence posts farther south. A dead horse was found with no visible wound. Its eyes burst from the sockets as if it had been crushed by pressure from the inside. A farmer reported hearing bells in the woods where no church stood. And once, at dawn, Nathan saw smoke rising from the low hills east of the settlement, but when he climbed there with Silas and 2 other men, they found only a circle of disturbed earth, blackened roots, and the remains of a campfire that could not have been more than hours old. Someone had been moving through the territory while the land shook itself apart. Someone had been using the panic. Then in early January, a woman arrived from a cabin east of the river with a baby in one arm and a shotgun in the other. Her name was Ruth Ellery, and she looked like a person who had already buried too much of her own life to be afraid of what came next. She told the town council that 3 strangers had come to her property during the worst of the quakes asking about a buried French chest her husband had once claimed existed under the old orchard. Nathan remembered the scarred man immediately. Ruth said the strangers were not trappers, not soldiers, and not local men. They spoke softly to one another, wore clean boots despite the mud, and knew too much about the land. One of them carried a ledger wrapped in oilcloth. "A ledger?" Nathan asked. Ruth nodded. "Names in it, dates too. My husband saw enough to know it mattered, then they came for him." "What happened to him?" Her face hardened. "He vanished before morning." No one in the room spoke after that. The frontier had already taught these people that death was common, but disappearance was worse. Death could be mourned. Disappearance left room for imagination, and imagination was a predator with no belly full enough to sleep. That same evening, Nathan found Silas alone at the church, staring at the floorboards under the pulpit. The younger man looked as if he had not slept in days. "What are you doing?" Nathan asked. Silas did not answer immediately. Then he lifted one of the boards with shaking fingers. Beneath it was a narrow cavity. Inside the cavity lay a small box, water-stained and wrapped in cloth. Nathan knelt beside him. Silas opened the box. Inside was an old Spanish coin, a strip of parchment, and a ring of black hair tied with red thread. The parchment bore the same carved mark Nathan had seen on the tree. And beneath the mark was a line written in a careful, slanted hand. He knows where the ground is weakest. Nathan looked up. Who wrote that? Silas swallowed. I think it was left here before the earthquakes. By who? Silas lifted his eyes, and for the first time Nathan saw real fear there. I think by someone who expected this to happen. The phrase sat between them like a stone. Expected. Not feared. Expected. That night, while another aftershock rolled through the settlement, Nathan made a decision that would drag him deeper into the heart of the mystery. He would follow the trail the strangers had left behind, not because he was brave. He was not because he believed he could stop whatever was unfolding. He did not believe that either. He followed because once a man sees the edge of a hidden thing, he cannot pretend not to know it is there. By lantern light and frozen breath, Nathan, Silas, and Dobbins rode east along the broken trail toward the abandoned Spanish earthworks that old hunters still spoke of in whispers. The land was scarred. Fissures had split the soil in long, jagged seams. In some places, water bubbled up where there had been none before. In others, the ground had sunk so sharply that trees leaned at impossible angles like witnesses refusing to look at the crime. They reached the earthworks by nightfall. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a ruined mound overgrown with weeds and snow-dusted brush. But Dobbins knew better. He had been in the territory longer than almost anyone alive and recognized old military work when he saw it. Spanish built this? Nathan asked. Dobbins grunted. Long before most of us were born, used to hold stores, maybe powder, maybe something else. At the mound's base, they found the same carved mark on a wooden stake. And beneath it, half buried in frozen dirt, a trench entrance hidden by old boards. The air coming from below was stale and wet. Silas crossed himself again. Dobbins cocked his pistol. Nathan took the lantern and went first. The passage descended into darkness cut by the yellow ring of flame. The walls were packed earth reinforced with rotten timber. The floor was slick with condensation. Somewhere ahead, water dripped in slow, deliberate beats. At the end of the passage, they found a chamber. Inside were crates. Dozens of them. Some had rotted open, some remained bound with iron. On one crate in faded Spanish ink, Nathan could just make out the outline of a shipping seal. On another, in English, there was a handwritten inventory list. Not supplies. Records. Bundles of papers, maps, land surveys, treaty drafts, census pages, lists of names from settlements up and down the river, dates, transfers, claims, deaths. And in a locked iron chest at the far wall, the thing Ruth had described. A ledger. Nathan held it with both hands because it felt heavier than it should have, as if the names inside were anchored to the earth itself. He opened it carefully. The pages were filled with references to land, movement, property, and resettlement. Some of the names were local. Some belonged to men from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. Others were Spanish. A few were crossed out. Several had strange symbols beside them. Near the back of the ledger, there was one repeated phrase written over and over in different ink. When the river changes, the frontier changes with it. Nathan turned the page and found a dated entry from years before the earthquakes. The line will fail at the weakest ground, the water will know first. He looked up. Silas had gone pale. Dobbins was already at the chamber wall, prying at a seam in the stone foundation. What is it? Nathan asked. Dobbins looked over his shoulder. A second room. They forced it open. What lay beyond was not treasure. It was evidence. Stacks of paper, survey stakes, surveyor's chains, old correspondence, and one final crate sealed tighter than the others containing official-looking documents from more than one authority, all tied together by the same hidden thread. Someone had been mapping the instability of the region for years, perhaps longer, and had used the hidden earthworks as a storage place for information valuable enough to kill over. Why would anyone do that? The answer came at dawn. Outside the trench, hoofbeats approached. Nathan extinguished the lantern. Silas raised his pistol. Dobbins moved to the entrance with the grim patience of an old man who had seen too many bad men come wearing the face of business. The riders dismounted, voices echoed in the cold. The scarred man was among them. He did not shout, he did not need to. His voice, when it came, was calm and almost polite. "I know you found the ledger," he said. Nathan's stomach tightened. "You should bring it out," the man continued. "There is no need for anyone to die over this." Dobbins laughed once, a dry, humorless sound. "That ship sailed, son." A pause. Then the scarred man spoke again, and there was something almost regretful in it. "You do not understand what is coming." That was the moment Nathan understood the true shape of the danger. It was not greed alone. It was not theft. It was planning. The earthquakes were not just random violence. They were a catastrophe so large, so useful that men with power and knowledge could use the panic to erase records, shift claims, bury evidence, and reshape ownership while everyone else was too frightened to notice. The land was breaking. And people were using the breaking. That was what made the story dark enough to haunt Nathan for the rest of his life. Not that the earth shook, not that the river reversed, not even that a town might vanish under disaster. It was that someone somewhere had looked at a wounded world and seen opportunity. The scarred man ordered the riders to advance. Nathan does not remember every second that followed with perfect clarity. He remembered smoke and shouting and the crack of a pistol in the tight mouth of the trench. He remembered Silas firing first and missing. He remembered Dobbins charging with a rifle like a man half his age. He remembered the passage filling with noise and dirt and the smell of black powder. And then, beneath all of it, he felt the earth move again. Not a tremor. A deep rolling heave. The chamber walls groaned, dust fell in curtains, one of the support beams snapped with a sound like a musket breaking. The riders outside shouted in alarm. The trench collapsed. Nathan dragged Silas toward the entrance as the ground above them split in a long crack that swallowed one of the horses whole. Dirt rained down, men screamed. The scarred man vanished into chaos, whether by death or escape Nathan never learned. By the time the shaking ended, the hidden chamber was gone. Buried. Sealed. Erased by the very force its owners had tried to exploit. The ledger, however, survived. Nathan took it back to New Madrid wrapped in oilcloth, where it was eventually hidden among church records and forgotten by everyone except the 3 men who had seen its contents. Dobbins refused to speak of the trench again. Silas became a preacher 2 years later and never mentioned the coin, the parchment, or the hair tied with red thread. Ruth Ellery rebuilt her cabin and outlived all 3 of them. As for Nathan, he never stopped listening to the ground. The earthquakes did not end all at once. They lingered through the winter and into the spring of 1812. New cracks opened. Wells changed, the riverbanks kept collapsing, families left the region in fear, others stayed because they had nowhere else to go. The frontier, already harsh, became meaner after the quakes, as if the land had absorbed a portion of the suffering and returned it to the people in their bones. Nathan eventually left the Mississippi country and moved west, then east again, then west once more, as river men often did, carrying the burden of places no map could fully describe. He married, had children, and told his story only once to a grandson who wrote too slowly to keep up. By then the earthworks were gone. The settlement of New Madrid had changed. The river had resumed its long course as if nothing monstrous had ever happened. But the land remembers. So do the people who survive it. Long after Nathan was dead, long after the names in the ledger were lost to dust and water and war, river men still spoke of the winter when the Mississippi turned backward. Some called it a miracle, some called it judgment, some called it the oldest proof that the frontier was never empty, only waiting. And if you ever stand near that river in the stillness before dawn, when the current looks black and silent and the banks seem to hold their breath, you may understand why the men of 1811 were so frightened. It was not simply that the earth shook. It was that the earth seemed to know something they did not. Something buried. Something waiting. Something that had been there long before the first cabin was raised, long before the first treaty was signed, long before any mapmaker dared to draw a line across the dark. And once the river had seen it exposed, it never let the frontier forget. This story gives your U.S. audience a mix of real frontier history, the 1811–1812 New Madrid earthquakes, Mississippi River survival, hidden records, early American fear, and the idea that disaster can be used by powerful people in the shadows.